Silent scan.
Underground grid connected. Please insert your passkey. Passkey accepted. Downloading payload. Upcycled, Part 2. Sarah kept a garden of flowers around the front of their cabin. She was outside tending to them when Hal walked out to give her a glass of water. He found her collapsed and unconscious. It had been the loud shattering of glass and then Hal's screams that drew me out front. I found him leaning over Sarah, shaking her and trying to rouse her. I'll never forget the look of devastation on his face. Without another word, he scooped her up into his arms and made a run for the hospital. Sarah's father's position meant that Sarah was given access to the best medical attention our town could give. Hal was a mess the entire time. He was reluctant to allow the doctors to take Sarah, and he paced long and hard until he was allowed back to see her. She was weak and barely able to keep her eyes open when they let us back. Hal took her hand, pressing it to his lips, tears welling in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. The first thing he said to her was, "I love you, Sarah. I love you so much." She managed to croak out that she loved him too before closing her eyes and falling back to sleep. I sat with my brother. He refused to leave Sarah's side, refused to let go of her hand, while her father spoke quietly with the doctors. They explained that Sarah was currently stable, but that they were running tests to find out and rule out the underlying cause. Several days went by. It was difficult to get Hal to eat or drink anything. When Sarah was conscious, he took the time to speak to her as much as possible, reminding her how much he loved her and hanging on her every word with that intense, focused way of his. When she was too weak to speak, he read her favorite passages from her book. And when she slept, he just sat there, holding tightly to her hand and refusing to let go, and staring into her face as if he was trying to memorize every line. He didn't sleep much, and what little he did was done with his head bent beside her. Finally, the doctors entered to tell us their conclusions. The results weren't good. Sarah was dying. After the news was delivered, I slid my hand into my brother's and squeezed. He was staring unseeingly at the doctor. He blinked a few times, shaking his head. I don't understand, he said. She was fine just a few days ago. I know this must be terribly difficult for all of you. For now, we are keeping Sarah comfortable. How long? Hal demanded. The doctor hesitated. How long? Dr. Morris's mouth pressed into a hard line, and she took a steadying breath before answering. A few days, maybe a week. That was the moment. The moment that shattered my brother into tiny, unrecognizable pieces. He began pacing frantically about the room, running his hands through his long blonde hair, shaking his head and muttering to himself. Sarah's father thanked the doctor, tears welling up in his eyes, and she excused herself from the room. We exchanged a look and I mouthed the words, "I'm so sorry." He only nodded and sunk into a chair before I slowly made to approach my brother. "Henry," I began quietly, but he ignored me. His pacing was becoming more frenetic. "This isn't happening," he was muttering. "This isn't happening. She was fine. I took him gently by the arm. His blue eyes met mine, and his lips quivered. I hugged him tightly, and the moment he was in my arms, he collapsed to the floor. The sobs were so violent they racked his whole body. We stayed that way a long time. I have no idea how long it was, but it seemed like an eternity before the tears ran dry and exhaustion began to drag him into unconsciousness. When I pulled him to his feet, he crawled into bed next to Sarah and clung to her like a small child. I don't know if it was the utter devastation on his face or the faraway look in his eyes, but I knew that smiling version of my brother that Sarah had uncovered was gone. It had died on that hospital floor. In some ways, Sarah's quick passing was a blessing. It saved all of us from having to watch her slowly wither away. But my brother was never the same. He didn't cry again, or if he did, it was never in my presence. The focus and attention he was so adored for disappeared. The pensive and peaceful look he had when pondering had turned to a constant zombie-like daze. Sarah's funeral was held at the lake where she and Hal had married. Her body was laid upon a bed of flowers. Pretty much the whole town showed up to show their support and gift words of love, but Hal didn't seem to hear or notice any of them. When it came time to put the black sheet over her body, her father addressed the whole crowd. Though I can't remember exactly what he said, I remember thinking it was lovely. He invited Hal up to speak. It wasn't until he stumbled and Rich caught him by the arm that I realized he was drunk. Hal's empty gaze dropped to Sarah. He stared at her for a long time. Everyone had begun to think Hal had nothing to say, and Rich was about to take him by the arm and lead him away when he finally spoke. "Sarah was the love of my life," he said simply. Then he turned and walked back towards the direction of their cabin. The sheet was pulled over Sarah's head, and moments later a bright flash appeared and a rush of heat filled the air. Then the outline of her body disintegrated beneath the cloth. I checked on my brother every day for the first couple weeks. I found him sitting with crossed arms, staring with an angry frown on his face at the urn in which Sarah's ashes had been placed. It was an impossible task to get him to eat or drink. It was impossible to tell if the dark circles forming under his eyes were from lack of nourishment or lack of sleep. He had begun to wither away. Muscles began to turn to lean skin and bones. The stubble that had always been so well maintained became a scraggly beard. Those eyes that used to be so full of presence became vacant. He had stopped speaking altogether. In the middle of the second week, I enlisted the help of Rich. We were both surprised when he sent a doctor to Hal's place, and he didn't so much as move when they injected an IV into his arm and gave him a sedative. They managed to get him into bed before the doctor expressed their concerns. "Your brother went through something traumatizing. He has severe depression. I know it may seem extreme, but you might want to consider this," they said, handing me a brochure. "I'll come by tomorrow." I stared after the doctor as they exited the tiny cabin and closed the door behind them. Rich gave me a sympathetic look. "I can stay if you want," he offered. I shook my head. "Thanks, but you don't have to do that. I'll stay with him tonight. Besides, he's asleep, so..." My voice trailed off, and it occurred to me how strange it sounded even to my own ears. The last several weeks had left me exhausted and depleted. Rich nodded, giving me a hug before turning to leave, but he paused before he reached the door. He looked back over one shoulder at me. "I know it's not for everyone," he said, nodding to the brochure in my hand. "But maybe give it a think. It did wonders for Sarah's mother." I felt myself frowning as Rich closed the door behind him. It wasn't until I was alone that I took a look at the brochure in my hand. My stomach immediately soured. In bold lettering, the words, "A better life is possible," was written across the top of the cover page. Below those words was an image of a smiling man, followed by the words, "Upcycle your life today." I slammed the brochure on the table so hard it rattled, disgusted with the suggestion that my brother would be better off erasing himself. Though I had never met anyone who had gone through with the procedure, I'd heard stories about people who had upcycled. Suddenly, Rich's words replayed in my head, and I swallowed hard against the bile rising in my throat. Was that why Sarah's mother wasn't around? Had she upcycled? I suddenly found myself wondering what could possibly cause a mother to want to forget her husband, her daughter, and her entire life. I shoved away from the table and moved to sit in the large armchair at the foot of the bed. There, I watched Hal sleep until my eyes began to grow heavy. I woke to the sound of birds chittering outside. I'd slept in the chair all night, and I groaned when a particularly painful crick in my neck made itself apparent. It took me a second, having just been dragged from the depths of unconsciousness, to realize that Hal's bed was empty. Then everything snapped into place. I jumped to my feet. "Hal?" I called, realizing the door to the cabin was wide open. The brochure from last night was not on the table. I took off, running. I was out of breath and sweating by the time I made it to the large glass building at the other end of town. I was caught by 2 flock women the moment I stepped inside the Upcycled center, screaming desperately for my brother. They were beginning to escort me outside when my screams caught the attention of a woman with red hair. Hal Jeffries? She asked over the rim of her black spectacles. I nodded, going limp in the arms of the flock. My brother, I replied breathlessly. Is he here? The woman waved at the 2 flock and they released me. She approached slowly, then took off her glasses before addressing me again. He didn't tell you, did he? She asked. I blinked at her. She wasn't making any sense. She sighed. I'm so sorry, but your brother is gone. He upcycled this morning. A sharp pain sliced through my chest, and I gripped the fabric of my collar as if it might keep me from falling apart or falling over. What? Where is he? I can't tell you that, she said calmly. He asked for a closed file, which means he is likely already on a train with papers for a new province. I'm sorry he didn't tell you himself. I don't think I even replied to her. My feet were suddenly moving, and then I found myself squinting from the light of the sunlight outside. Then suddenly I was home, sitting in a chair, staring at the wall. For years, I never knew what happened to Hal. I tried to imagine him happy somewhere. I tried to think up of a new personality for him with new people and a new life. I wondered if some part of him ever missed me in some way. Could upcycled people even have feelings like that after they were erased and their false identities were implanted? But eventually I stopped trying to think about it. Stopped trying to imagine. It only ever left me feeling sick and empty. It took a long time, but eventually I came to terms with the fact that he was gone. I thought I would never see him again. Like Sarah had been about the headaches, I was wrong. I hadn't thought much about it when the town was called into the square for a mandatory announcement. It had been a while since new racers had been introduced in the Genesis Island races, so it wasn't a surprise when we found out that was the cause of the gathering. So many new arrivals didn't make it past their first week on the island that Global Genesis had long since stopped making immediate introductions. Nothing could have prepared me for the rush of emotions I felt at seeing him again, and the devastating realization that he had ended up in the deadly races. When his face first appeared on screen, I almost didn't recognize him. His blonde hair was shorter than he ever used to keep it, cropped so that the widow's peak at the center of his forehead was visible. His face, which had been scruffy ever since he had facial hair, was clean-shaven, and his eyes. The right one was completely gold, the mark of a dishonorably discharged flock. I held my breath, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. Hal's new name appeared in bold lettering beneath his face. Jack Ferris. Only the names of convicted degenerates were given in the deadly races. Suddenly, everyone's attention was fixed on me as people began to whisper and murmur in hushed tones. There was no escape. To leave right there in that moment would have meant a strike and a trip to correction. I was trapped. So when I felt I could walk again, I made my way to the bar and I got myself a drink. Then Rich bought me another, and someone else after that. My plan was to get so stinking drunk that I would have no memory of that night. I succeeded, mostly. Though at the end of the race I was vaguely aware of Rich muttering to me that Hal, Jack, had survived, as he and someone else walked me home. I don't think I have ever been that sick before or since. When I was feeling better, Rich stopped by to check on me. I asked him point blank about Sarah's mother. His lips had pressed into a hard line, and he was so quiet for so long I thought he might not answer me. He took a seat, and then proceeded to tell me about Sarah's younger sister who had died during labor. Amy never got over it, he admitted quietly. When she asked me to help her upcycle, I was... He took a steadying breath and shook his head, devastated. I used every possible argument I could think of, but she had made up her mind. I didn't know she had requested a closed file until I had finished the procedure. Rich's voice grew strained and he swallowed hard. I knew having her come home as a completely different person was going to be hard. I wasn't sure how Sarah was going to take it, but I never expected her to leave us. The procedure room was the last time I ever saw her in person. After that, I left the Upcycled Center, transferred to another government-sanctioned job doing paperwork. I blinked at his confession, utterly speechless. When I found words again, all I could say was, "Rich, I am so sorry." Rich leaned back in his chair and stared vacantly at the wall, hands gripping the armrest lightly as if to steady himself. "I found out about her new life similarly to the way you found out about Jack," he said, his gaze shifting to me. "Catherine is her new name. She serves the hand of Noah Claverian in the Capitol in Genesis City." We both fell silent for a long time. Then Rich got to his feet. "I'm truly sorry about your brother," he breathed, before walking out the door. "I have no idea what will happen to my brother. As far as I know, he has managed to stay alive, at least for now. But I can't help but wonder, are Jack and Catherine's upcycled identities a coincidence? Or are all upcycled with closed files being turned into mindless grunts working for the benefit of global Genesis? And how many other convicted degenerates are just upcycles who fought against that programming? Do you think it's possible any of them can be brought back? I'd like to think so. This is Blake C. Holloway. We hope you have enjoyed this production of Upcycled Part 2 by Blake C. Holloway. This program was produced and directed by B. Holla Entertainment. Text copyright 2025 by Blake C. Holloway. Production copyright 2025 by B. Holla Entertainment. All rights reserved. This is a copyrighted work. Unauthorized copying or distribution is a crime. Transmission terminated.